Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about educating ourselves and organizing around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. So we have a guest today, David Schwartzman. Some of the social media had his son on it, Peter Schwartzman. We hope to get him in the future. And I'll get to David in a minute. Just want to say a few words about really the dismal situation that we're in and just briefly go over 5 crises we face. One of them is democracy. And we just had astounding news this week that, Trump and the Republicans were really trying to do a coup. They drafted executive orders to seize the voting machines and steal the election. And then yesterday, the Republican National Committee said the rioters at the national Capitol, some of whom were engaged in violent assaults, are being persecuted for engaging in what the Republican National Committee called, quote, legitimate political discourse, end quote. You have this guy that's likely to be the next Michigan Speaker of their lower house saying recently that his people should bring guns to the polling places and be prepared to use them. And, we got these far-right militias, but we have a very well-armed base to the Republican Party that seems to not care what the vote is. They just want to get to power. So in the states, the Republicans are making it harder to vote. But what's worse is they're taking over the administration of elections so they can steal elections. And we haven't anything like this since the old Democrats, under the slogan of white supremacy, violently overthrew the Reconstruction governments, 150 years ago. So that's serious. But meanwhile, the Democrats have failed, and they don't have a plan to revive these bills for voting rights and election protection. They seem to be resigned to making it a campaign message rather than mobilizing to try to get this legislation passed. And meanwhile, they're making ballot access for the Green Party. And party suppression is a form of voter suppression. Voting rights should include the right of candidates' access to the ballot as well as voter access to the ballot, so voters can vote for who they want. So I think Greens have got to make inclusive democracy, I think that's the slogan we should use, a top issue, which means not only easy access to the ballots and protecting our elections from Republican efforts to steal them, but also bills for fair ballot access, ranked choice voting for executive offices, and proportional representation for legislative bodies. And this is something these are issues, particularly RCV and proportional representation, we can move at every level, local, state, and federal. Fair ballot access, we can do at the state and the federal level. And Greens in this upcoming election and in our movement work should be shaming and putting both parties on the defensive because they're not defending democracy. So that's one crisis. And we got this Ukraine crisis. And I think the solution is clear. The U.S. should be supporting the Normandy format where France, Germany, Russia, and the Ukraine have been engaged in negotiating originally the Minsk II Accords, and they just had a meeting on January 26 where they reaffirmed their commitment. So the U.S. should stop saber rattling and support these negotiations. The political solution that Minsk outlined is clear that, beyond Minsk, U.S. NATO should agree that they're not going to admit Georgia and the Ukraine into the NATO military alliance, give Russia some security guarantees. And in return, Russia should guarantee Ukraine's independence. And then Ukraine should guarantee its Russian-speaking minorities their rights. And the implementation, which is coming out of this Normandy format, a ceasefire in Donbass in the southeast, demilitarization. Some have suggested it could be enforced by a UN peacekeeping force. So the U.S. would withdraw its advisors from Ukraine and stop sending more arms to Ukraine, and Russia would withdraw its mercenaries from the Donbass. And then we should also push for international reconstruction aid for the Donbass region, which has been tore up by this war. So that, is not really that hard to do. But the problem right now, from our perspective, is our government is fueling the fire. And I know that the Democrats are trying to fast track another $500 million in weapons. I didn't see that it passed. Maybe it did, or maybe I missed it. But that's what the Democrats are pushing, and the Republicans want even more. So we gotta build this anti-war movement. Third thing is the COVID crisis. We just passed 900,000 dead from COVID in the United States this week. This week, 2,600 were dying a day. And we got the far right Republicans fighting common sense public health measures like mask and vaccine mandates. And the Democrats, on the other hand, are joining with the Republicans and pushing to reopen the economy without the public health protections that were embodied, for example, in OSHA. Those regulations, emergency regulations, are going out. They are responding to business that just wants to push workers back to work, whether it's safe or not. You can see that in the reduction of the quarantine period from 10 days to 5 days that the CDC recommends. And there really isn't science behind that, but there is business pressure. And teachers and nurses in particular have resisted this. But that's where we're headed. So we've got to defend these frontline workers. And then meanwhile, one of the reasons the U.S. has such a high per capita death rate is that we don't have a national healthcare system. We got, a lot of private insurance, some public programs that cover some people. And so in California this week, the Democrats killed single payer again. Second time. They joined in Hawaii, Vermont, and New York in cases where the Democrats promised single payer. They got control of both chambers of the legislature and the governorship, and suddenly they couldn't do it because of all this legalized bribery coming from the health insurance industry into the coffers of the Democratic Party. So that's why we need the Green Party to keep pushing for Medicare for all. Fourth crisis we need to think about is the border crisis. I mean, the cruelty going on there, it's like Stephen Miller and Donald Trump were still, in office. This week, the Biden administration reconfirmed their commitment to Title 42, which was a Trump-initiated policy that expels migrants without any due process for their appeal for immigration or asylum on the grounds of preventing COVID. So under this law, 1.5 million migrants have been deported. I mean, we should just give the migrants a vaccine. And, that's a big problem because, Biden is protecting big pharma patents and profits rather than using the many authorities he has, for example, the Defense Production Act, to socialize vaccine patents in order for them to be available around the world at much lower cost so the world can get vaccinated. Because right now, COVID's running wild, evolving new variants that come back to infect the whole world, including the United States. Again, that's why we need a socialized healthcare system that puts people before profits. And then the fifth crisis, and there are more, but I'm just going to limit it to 5, is the climate crisis. Build Back Better is dead. The climate portion of it was all corporate welfare for renewable generations and electric vehicles, but no mandates, no schedule for reducing carbon emissions. All of it was public subsidies for private business, which leaves the corporations in charge. It doesn't change who has the power, the corporations or the people. And we know that the corporations are going to put profits first. And if it's profitable to continue emitting greenhouse gases, that's what they're going to do, even if they're getting subsidies to build some renewables and electric vehicles and charging stations. Again, that's why we need the Greens pushing an eco-socialist Green New Deal, where we have public ownership and democratic administration, particularly in the power, transportation, manufacturing, and financial sectors, so we can make a rapid transition to 100% clean energy and zero and soon negative carbon emissions. So, the Green Party needs to get its act together and really put these issues on the table. Which brings in our guest today, David Schwartzman. That's why we're having David. He's an emeritus professor of biology at Howard University, who is focused on biogeochemistry, earth sciences and solar energy. He's one of the leading thinkers in the world on the eco-socialist Green New Deal. He's active in the DC statehood Green Party. He's run for office with them. He's the author of the book, The Earth is Not for Sale, with his son, the environmental scientist and Green Mayor of Galesville, Illinois. That's Peter Schwartzman. The subtitle of that book is A Path Out of Fossil Capitalism to the Other World That Is Still Possible. And so I've asked David to say a few words about what that path is, how it's still feasible, maybe talk about how we end energy poverty so everybody in the world has access to the highest quality of life, and just about eco-socialism generally. So
well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And unlike my son, Peter, I never got elected, but he did. Of course, with a much smaller city. But I'm still a leader in the DC Stated Green Party on many fronts. And matter of fact, I'll post in the chat an article I just did on a Green New Deal for DC, revisiting that. And so I'm going to now do what Howie asked me to do. So I'm actually, when he said I was a professor of biology, I was in a department of biology, but I'm actually a biogeochemist, an energy and climate scientist. So I'm not a biologist. There's a long story behind that, but why I'm in the Department of Biology. But here's the what we have been studying, my oldest son and I in particular, for over 10 years. We are been modeling a transition globally to a renewable energy system. And when renewable energy, that would be primarily wind and high efficiency collection of solar energy, which is mainly photovoltaics and concentrated solar power in desert regions. But those are really the big three, and there's complementary supplies from smaller sources as well. But those are the main ones. So we in our research, our publications have, I think, demonstrated that technically, with the present technology we have, it is possible to transition in just a few decades globally, and completely terminating the consumption of fossil fuels. And let me say, since Howie mentioned, maybe he didn't before it started, nuclear power. Matter of fact, we're very pro-nuclear power, but the nuclear power we're for is at a safe distance, 93 million miles away. It is the fusion reactor in the sun. We don't need fission power on Earth, on the surface of the Earth. It is unwelcome. First of all, it's very expensive. It takes too long to site, and it diverts resources from other that we need to use for truly a renewable energy transition. And of course, well-known risks, extreme risks from fission power as well. So just want to mention that we are pro-solar nuclear power, and we don't need to we don't need to spend billions of dollars to build a fusion reactor on the surface of the Earth. Again, a big diversion of resources. We should push for these resources, these funds going to site wind and solar now. And this is, as Howie indicated, this is an emergency. The longer we wait for this transition, that is a full 100% wind solar transition globally and termination of fossil fuels, the greater the chance that we will breach the warming target of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is 1.5 degrees centigrade. and that's only 0.3 degrees centigrade over the present global temperature, surface temperature. So we have not much time to do it. It is still possible to meet that target with a very robust transition that starts very soon. And our book website actually has several resources, including our latest paper on this modeling this transition. So it's full text. You can open up the link and read the paper for yourself. So the feasibility is there. Again, there are huge political economic obstacles, the main one being the power of militarized fossil capital globally. And of course, we see this power even in the Biden administration, and certainly the blocking of a really a climate-friendly Build Back Better with Manchin and so on, blocking even that very modest program. So that's the enemy that we need to overcome. Now, I was asked to talk about energy poverty. Well, most people in the world suffer from energy poverty. That means they are consuming too little energy to live to the highest quality of life, to the highest life expectancy that a few rich countries in the global north enjoy. Japan, matter of fact, has the highest life expectancy globally. And the US ranks about 40 in the world. By the way, Cuba is very close to it with consuming much less energy. And they're suffering from energy poverty too, as a result of the US sanctions and blockade. So most of the world, people of the world suffer from energy poverty. They do not have enough energy to live to the highest life expectancy that is presently enjoyed by a few countries. Now, how is that energy going to be supplied? Well, renewable, because it should not be supplied by fossil fuels, which actually kills probably 7-8 million people a year just from air pollution. So that's the bottom line on energy poverty. And I think in the follow-up discussion, we can get into how much energy is required and so on. I think Howie's particularly interested in that. Now, one major concern about a renewable energy transition is extractivism. That is, extractive industries such as mining that really have big negative impacts on people around the world, especially indigenous communities. And it's a very legitimate concern, but there are solutions that could minimize this and actually phase out extractivism. The biggest one is building a renewable energy infrastructure itself, because that energy will allow very efficient recycling of metals, which is not being done now. There is some recycling, like aluminum cans. As a matter of fact, the energy needed to extract aluminum from aluminum ore, bauxite, is much greater than the energy just to melt an aluminum can down and reusing the aluminum. So there's energy savings there that actually can reduce extractivism even now, extractive mining. But then we have a huge opportunity in a robust solar transition guided by eco-socialist perspective, and that is to not only terminate the infrastructure of the fossil fuels globally, which has a lot of metals in it, by the way, but also the military-industrial complex. Military airplanes have a lot of cobalt in them. So demilitarization is going to be almost certainly a necessary part of a transition to this other world that's possible. And that will also free up metals that could be recycled with a growing solar power globally. And that's, I think I took 10 minutes. So, or did I? You want me to talk a little bit more about any of this? Let's begin the discussion. I put the resource again, our book website, theearthisnotforsale.org, and you can find our publications on that website as well.
Okay, well, why don't you elaborate on the energy poverty? How much energy is needed to reach that highest possible life expectancy? And how much more energy is the U.S. using? How far short is the global South? Elaborate on that, because
Okay.
part of our Green New Deal is an economic Bill of Rights, and part of the politics of getting the Green New Deal passed is that it meets the basic needs of people as well as invest in this transition.
Okay, so if you actually a Canadian geographer who's published a lot of books, Vlhkov Schmil, really pioneered in looking at this issue, and he plotted graphs of life expectancy and human development index versus energy consumption per person by nation. So a nation will have a certain level of primary energy consumption. Okay, well, I say primary because if you burn coal, for instance, a lot of that energy is waste heat and doesn't go to do work. So primary is the total energy to generate the energy consumption that ends up in the population. So the energy consumed per person is a measure. And we use power units, and I'll explain that. The minimum energy to reach the highest life expectancy in the world today is about 3 kilowatt per person. Now, kilowatt is a power unit. A power equals energy consumed per time. So in 1 year, a person at that level of consumption would be consuming 3 kilowatt year of energy. Just like you pay electric bill, kilowatt hours, you're paying for energy. So it's the kilowatt times, which is a power unit, times the time. That's the energy unit. U.S. is now consuming a little over 9 kilowatt per person, a little over 9. Very high, very wasteful consumption of energy, which is expressed in many ways in our society. Building huge, rich people building huge houses, everyone driving a car everywhere instead of promoting more investment in rail and public transportation and so forth. So U.S. has very wasteful consumption of energy. We could do much better in the U.S. by consuming much less energy per person by changing the modes that we live by. And that would actually be cleaner air, cleaner soil, cleaner food, and so on. People would live better than they're living now with using less energy, but it has to be planned. It has to be designed. And for example, as you mentioned, Howie, there is in the Triple B bill, there was actually a subsidy. So, build electric cars. Having hundreds of millions of electric cars instead of fossil fuel cars is not really the solution, right? You'll still have huge traffic congestion, huge resource consumption, like extractivism, and it's much better to put the investment into public transit. Yes, electrified public transit powered by renewable energy. That's a much better solution than this alternative. Now, Cuba is consuming, according to the latest data, which is 2016. The data I just gave was 2019 for the U.S. and for the minimum, globally. For the highest life expectancy, Cuba is consuming about 1 kilowatt per person. Now, Cuba does very well under its state of energy poverty, basically probably tied or maybe even greater, higher life expectancy than the U.S. Because it has a very strong public health system and education, and they prioritize that in their society, which, of course, this is not the case in the United States. So Cuba could do much better and reach a highest world standard life expectancy by increasing its energy consumption using clean energy, wind and solar. So the challenge in the world today really is to have a renewable energy transition that eliminates energy poverty and essentially recognizes the right of every child living in the planet to live to the highest quality of life and life expectancy. So it isn't simply to, as some degrowthists have promoted, the global south could do better with a, quote, decent standard of living, which would bring them up maybe to a little below Cuba's life expectancy. Well, I find that really Eurocentric arrogance. Why should a child living in the global south only live to this, let's say, decent life standard, rather than the highest that every child has a right to enjoy? And that's our responsibility in the global climate and energy justice movement, really, to see that to happen.
Yeah, COP26 really came up short on that, with the U.S. leading the resistance to what some people call climate reparations, but it's basically, the way I see it, an investment in the habitability of the planet for all of us.
Yes.
And when Biden claimed he was going to get to a 50% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, based on a program that had no hope of doing that, a number of environmental groups criticized him by saying, no, the U.S. share is 195%. Now, how do you get to 195%? Well, they said you cut U.S. emissions by 70%, and then you invest in this transition in the global south. That'll get your other 125%. And that's really important. This has got to be global, because more and more carbon emissions are coming from the global south, because global corporations have outsourced manufacturing there. Yes. And they're building fossil fuel transportation infrastructure to make that manufacturing in the global south possible. So, we could clean up our act and the planet will still boil. So,
yeah, that's a very good point. And people say, well, where's the money going to come from? Hello. The fact is that the IMF latest report estimates that nearly $6 trillion a year go to direct and indirect subsidies to fossil fuel consumption. Direct and indirect. And that includes, of course, all the negative health impacts of consuming fossil fuels. So that's over $5 trillion, between $5 and $6 trillion a year. The global military budget is now close to $2 trillion a year. So obviously there is a lack, that we need to change the priorities of where this funding should go. And that is really the challenge, is to undermine and terminate the power of the fossil capital and its political instruments to make that possible. And it is possible. And we can get into strategy, but which we have some thoughts about. But this is the resources are there. And let me make one other point. When I said this renewable energy transition is possible even today with present technology, that this technology is getting better. It's in the near future, there will be more efficient solar photovoltaic cells that could actually be created with less energy, and the same with wind power. And most wind power probably should be sited in the ocean, not on land. There's tremendous resources there. I saw a recent report about South Africa, that offshore wind in South Africa could actually, and South Africa actually is not suffering from energy poverty. It's above 3 kilowatt per person, but of course it has extreme wealth and income inequality, which the majority is not getting the benefits, and they're suffering from energy poverty. So there's roughly 8 times as much energy as they're presently consuming in South Africa can come from offshore wind. So the potential is, and this is why I'm an optimist in terms of technology, that this technology will only improve, get more efficient. And I should also mention, this came up in our previous discussions. Do you need fossil fuel to build renewable energy? Yes, because a little less than 80% of all the energy consumed in the world today is fossil fuel. You have to start with the energy that is presently available. However, the payback from right now from present technology for wind and solar is like you get at least 20 times as much energy from the lifetime of the technology that you need to build it. Okay, so the amount of energy going into required to make the technology becomes less and less. And in our modeling that we just did in the paper I mentioned, we show that it is less, about 5% of the proven reserves of fossil fuel will be needed in this transition. And that's consistent with the carbon budget that's left. That corresponds to 1.5-degree warming. Okay, so that is, most of the carbon has to be left in the ground. Okay, you know the slogan, keep the oil in the soil. I know what it's motivated by, but it's I always tell people on a march, it's a little bit crazy to say that, because if you put the oil in the soil, you can't grow anything. So it's much better keep the oil in the crust. I know that doesn't rhyme, but most of fossil fuel has to remain in the ground. And let me use this opportunity also to say what the priority should be in terms of what fossil fuel you use. What should be terminated first? Coal and natural gas. Coal and natural gas. In our modeling, we terminate in 10 years, and then we terminate conventional oil in 20 years in the full 100% renewable transition. Now, why did we do that? Because the highest greenhouse gas footprint, the highest contribution to warming per molecule, okay, of CO2 or methane is from coal and natural gas. Now, if you burn natural gas, which is mainly methane, for those who have a little chemistry, it's CH4, 1 atom of carbon and 4 of hydrogen. So when you burn methane, you get a lot of energy just by oxidizing the hydrogen. as well as a carbon. So it's only half the impact of oil, which is hydrocarbons. It's half the impact, sorry, of coal, which is mainly carbon, and oil is about 3/4 the impact of coal. But why natural gas is such a big greenhouse gas footprint is that it leaks directly to the atmosphere. And methane has a very potent greenhouse gas impact. That molecule, it absorbs infrared much more efficiently than carbon dioxide. So it has, by the way, that's just recently been highlighted in the news because they've identified by remote sensing where the real ultra emitters are on the planet from leaking wells and blah, blah, blah. Well, that will only deal with 10% of the methane emissions. Okay. So we have to terminate natural gas quickly, consumption, and terminate coal. And we'd have to respect climate and energy science in this eco-socialist transition. That's what's informed my research, is that you got to use the natural sciences and the physical sciences to inform an eco-socialist transition, okay, as well as a social. So I think I should stop talking.
Okay, well, we're starting to get questions in the chat, so
yeah,
start getting to them. I just wanted to comment that
the
self-reproducing renewable system doesn't need fossil fuels once it's self-reproducing.
Yes.
And that initial investment of fossil energy, preferably oil, is how we get there. And you get a lot of people, particularly the people that push degrowth, saying you need fossil fuels to build solar panels and wind generators, and they act like the technology, to produce solar panels and wind generators with electricity from solar, renewable solar, is not there, but it is. And I think that's something that we've got to bust. And you mentioned degrowth. It's really a question of what we're going to grow and what we're going to degrow. We're going to degrow fossil fuels, but we got to grow renewables if we're going to end energy poverty. So I hope people will keep those things in mind.
Can I mention there, Howie? Yes, that's a very good clarification. In our modeling, we certainly, that's part of our modeling. The point is, as you build more and more renewable, then it reproduces itself until you get to 100%, and then you don't need any other source. That's very important to mention. And then as far as the degrowth, can I say a little bit about degrowth?
Sure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that have to be degrown, not globally and the United States. How about the military-industrial complex? I mean, let's not only degrow it, let's terminate it. Okay, when I say industrial, we need a new industrial economy that is green, that is compatible with preserving biodiversity, which is compatible with protecting human health. So I'm not against industrialism per se. And some in the degrowthers say, well, industrial society is the enemy. No, it's fossil fuel capitalism, which is the barrier. It isn't. So I want to make that qualification. But degrowth, the main problem we have with the degrowth advocates is that they commonly say the world has to decrease its energy consumption. The world. The U.S. should decrease, but most of humanity needs more energy than it's consuming now in the form of, quote, clean energy. India, for example, is even below, roughly at Cuba's level, and they have extreme wealth inequality, and they live very short lives. So people in India need more energy to achieve the highest life expectancy. And so globally, let me give you a figure now, okay? And I'll close in this thought. Right now, the primary energy consumption globally is 19 trillion watts. So in 1 year, the world consumes 19 trillion watt years of energy. Okay, remember kilowatt hours. Okay, trillion watt years, they're both energy units. Now, if you multiply 3 kilowatt per person, which is the minimum to achieve the highest life expectancy, times the present world population, which is 7.9 billion people. Every time I look at the Google, I get a higher number, by the way. I mean, a few years ago, it was like 7 billion. Okay, well, we got to adjust it. So if you multiply 3 kilowatt per person times 7.9 billion people, you get 24 trillion watts. Okay, 24 trillion watt as a primary energy consumption in the world in power units, which is higher than we're consuming now. So that shows that at least in the near term, the world is going to need more energy. Now, as the efficiency of technology improves, then you could do the same work with less energy. There's an energy savings with increasing technological efficiency. And we have these estimates in our paper, in the paper I mentioned. And so that energy, that part of will decrease, but we're going to need energy in the future, very likely more energy for climate mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation means to have some impact on global warming, okay? For instance, to reduce the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere by burying it in the crust by chemical reaction. And there are technologies to do that now. But again, we begin with natural solutions, which could begin now, right? Like restoring natural ecosystems, ecological agriculture, regenerative agriculture, that all will draw carbon dioxide more into the soil and store it there. However, as even with a modest small warming, that capacity will decrease. And so in our modeling, we argue that we need to build sufficient renewable energy capacity to be able to address that challenge, okay, in the next few decades. And we can only address that challenge with more energy of renewable mode than we have now. That's climate protection, that's climate mitigation, and adaptation, of course. We need energy for adaptation too. That's a challenge that did not exist before, right? To adapt to ongoing climate warming, which disproportionately affects the poor, which disproportionately affects people living in the global south. And that's going to require more energy to actually address that. Give you one example, heat stress. We already see heat stress is already growing, even in the global north in cities in the US, right? During hot summers. Those hot summers will grow more frequently, and people living near the equator are going to suffer extreme heat stress, even keeping the warming at the 1.5 degree warming target. That's going to be a big challenge, and there are solutions, but that's going to take energy to address that. And that's something degrowthists commonly ignore, okay? That challenge.
I remember seeing a figure that 1/3 of Salvadorans have damaged kidneys from heat stress. Dehydration and dealing with the heat, particularly when they're doing agricultural work. So, this is serious. one last point, and then let's get some questions. I just want to underscore what you said about we got to cut the military-industrial complex. When the Democrats took the Green Party's signature issue, the Green New Deal, in 2019 and introduced a non-binding resolution to Congress, they cut out very important things like no new fossil fuel infrastructure and a ban on fracking,
Yes.
deep cuts in military spending, and also to phase out of nuclear power, and then extended the deadline to 20 years from 2030 to 2050 to get to zero, but they called it net zero, which is a way of opening the door for burning fossil fuels and supposedly capturing the carbon and sequestering it. And also burning waste, which releases all kinds of toxics. You mentioned fossil capitalism and industrialism. It's not just the global warming, it's most of the toxic chemicals that are new to the biosphere. So there are no enzymes that co-evolve to break them down and become carcinogenic and mutagenic and just mess with your endocrine system because they're all carbon-based molecules like life. That's really, since World War II in particular, now we have over 100,000 of these new chemicals, and that's out of that fossil capitalism as well. So, yeah, we got to take over the energy industry and put it in the public sector. We can't leave it to these corporations to make private decisions. What we've had with the incentives we've had for renewables is, yeah, they build more renewables, but they don't stop the fossils. So we have more energy, but we're burning as much fossil. The only reason the carbon has gone down is because there was a switch from coal to gas. But as you were explaining, when the methane is counted in with the gas that leaks from the well site and the pipelines and the compressor stations and where it's finally burned, it has the equivalent impact as coal in terms of global warming. So we really haven't gained ground there. So I did see a number of questions in the chat. So here we go. Linda Templin asks, what is the cleanest fuel to use for a flame, i.e. for cooking?
Electric. That's not a flame. Wait, listen, I have to, I'm not perfect. We have a gas stove. We have gas heating in my house. We got to get it replaced with, a heat pump and electric. Okay. And so the cleanest, that's natural gas. It's quote cleanest, but there's indoor air pollution from using a gas stove, nitrogen oxides that are really bad. And there's even methane emissions. They've found significant methane emissions from just using a stove in a home because methane escapes before it's burned. So that's a short answer to that. It's
and that's a case where we need a public program to pay the upfront capital costs of switching from gas to heat pumps and electric stoves, so people can start using it. And the savings, because they don't have to buy fuel all the time. Once that heat pump and electric stove is in there, then all you got to do is pay for the electricity. You don't have to pay for fuel. So you save, and then over time that savings can pay back. But there needs to be public financing of that. We have legislation for that advancing in New York, and we have New York City has said that no new building can be dependent on gas. It has to be electric, and we're going for that statewide. So this question will probably come up, what about a local Green New Deal? There you go. That's one thing, one part of a local Green New Deal. No new gas, and then find some kind of public program like a public municipal utility that can finance for their customers how to get off gas.
That's a very good point. Matter of fact, being in one of the leaders of the DC State of Green Party, I mentioned I wrote a recent article about a Green New Deal in DC, and that's one component. There is a project in DC called Beyond Gas, because methane is leaking right out of the streets from old pipes, and people are concerned about what you just said about subsidizing this shift. And it's an environmental justice issue. It's an economic justice issue. Absolutely.
Amy L. Sachs asks, Professor, is it true that oil corporations are already plotting to drill for oil under the melting polar frost up north? Can anything be done to stop them? Thanks.
I believe that didn't the court block? Maybe I'm wrong. There wasn't there recent action regarding the offshore, like in Alaska.
My recollection is
Yeah.
Obama okayed it, Shell tried it, and gave it up.
Oh, okay. That
Meanwhile-
requires some look. By the way, that's Amy Sachs,
Yeah.
and her photo is a black cat. And I have a white cat, by the way. Maybe the two cats should get together.
But I was going to add that Russia is moving ahead very aggressively.
Yes, yes.
They have launched one barge with 2 nuclear reactors on it to power drilling in the Arctic Ocean. They have 7 of those planned. So again, we need a global Green New Deal. We need to find our allies in Russia, which I would argue is the Russian Socialist movement. It's the closest thing to a Green Party. They led the fight against highways through the Green Belt around Moscow.
Yes.
But they have a hell of a time getting on the ballot. They have the same problem we do. So the candidates they endorsed had to run on the Communist Party, which still has a ballot line.
And they're starting to oppose Putin, by the way, according to latest reports. Instead of being an ally, they're actually opposing Putin. That's a good point, because Russia has huge wind resources that they could use, offshore. They have renewable energy, potential, huge potential. But that's true. There needs to be an eco-socialist class struggle in every country, right, to generate a eco-socialist Green New Deal. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in pure form. It'll start, with a state spending money, just like the stimulus program. Many trillions of dollars was created in the stimulus during the height of the pandemic, right? That could happen again in the beginnings of Green New Deal. But again, we need to push it to more and more an eco-socialist character, to really make it effective.
Yeah, the Communist Party in Russia had, for a long time, been pretty much allied with Putin. Yeah. And they've had a dissident left wing. But what really pissed them off was in September, one of their candidates, he wasn't a communist, he was an independent leftist, backed by the communists, backed by the Russian Socialist movement. He won an election, and then they counted the e-votes. And he lost the election. So the communists called big demonstrations.
Yeah.
First time. And, I don't know where it's gone since then, but, we need to find a way to, help those folks, at least give them moral support, which matters a lot to people that are struggling in difficult circumstances, and know that other people around the world care about them.
Any other questions I don't see the questions. I'm looking at the private chat. Here's another one.
Yeah. Okay. Eric Ray, hello, Professor Schwartzman. I'm considering running for local office here in Florida and wanted to know your opinion on what an eco-socialist Green New Deal would look like on the local and state level.
Okay, you know what? Now I'll put a link of the paper I just wrote that may give some ideas on that. But very briefly, there's a political dimension like ranked choice voting to push for that. There's economic dimensions to reduce income inequality, by taxing the rich. There's environmental and energy issue, and which we already been talking about, like municipalizing utilities locally, a public bank, creating a public bank, which is a movement around the country to I like to say more eco-socialism, less capitalism. That's what we could do locally, right? And I'll put that article in the chat that I could see while we're talking. Okay, I don't know if the viewers see that. Do they, Howie?
They see I believe they see the questions.
Oh, the chat, like the book
Yeah,
chat and that stuff.
yeah, because they talk back and forth on it to each
Okay,
other.
I can't see their questions though.
Well, under the general comments, some of them are back a ways.
Oh, okay, I didn't see that. But I'm going to put on the chat the article I just did.
You got to put it on the private chat for the moderator, and she'll put it on the comments.
Okay, thank you. That's the article that a long article I just did it on a online widely read site for people interested in DC politics. So, but that may give that Eric Gray some ideas.
Jay-Z asks, Professor Schwartzman, could energy poverty be driven back by ubiquitous renewables? For example, small-scale wind and solar generators scattered around communities but connected to the larger grid.
Absolutely. Decentralized solar is certainly going to be an important part of that process. And again, it needs to be implemented on different scales. So you're going to have big solar, you're going to have big wind farms like in the ocean, and you have a lot of decentralized renewables that are controlled by the local community and managed by the local community. Absolutely, that's part of an eco-socialist program for renewables, definitely. And as you mentioned, Howie, we need to nationalize energy, but at the same time, we have to decentralize the control as well and management of the local systems. And that's being already underway, just like agroecology all over the country, urban farms and so on.
Yeah, in our campaign, we put forward a model of a national publicly owned energy system that was controlled from the bottom up, so that you have local public energy districts, municipals,
right,
that elect boards publicly, and then those boards elect representatives to state and national coordinating boards, so that the controls from the bottom up and the detailed planning is made at the local level, where it's really important that be done. Siting these renewables is a big issue in getting them implemented. So it needs to be a bottom-up democratic system. And another thing, and David and I had an email exchange about this earlier in the week. Not only do you have to have the decentralized generation from wind and solar, you got to have a grid that connects them. And there's studies that say we need about $600 billion in investment to build that grid that can handle the renewables. And it's not being made. And you get this chicken and the egg problem where companies that want to build renewables hold back because they don't think the grid can handle it. And the owners of the grid won't build it till they wear out the grid they got. So, and they don't see the demand from the renewables. So, like, who's going to take the first step? That's why you need public planning. So this can be coordinated. And there was some money in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, $65 billion, about 10% of what we need. And Build Back Better added another, I think it was $9 billion, which is a drop in the bucket. So that's something people need to keep in mind when they're looking at their state plans. I mean, like here in New York, we're going big on offshore, but can the grid handle it? And it's not clear they've committed to the investments. It's called the Independent System Operator. New York Independent System Operator knows about the problem, but they don't have the money to build the grid. They're saying they need to build some new transmission lines. So that's something to keep in mind when you work on your state and local Green New Deals.
Let me mention, Howie, that I'll share with you on email. I can't find it right now, but there was a recent article about new software that's been developed to make this grid, you know, more compatible with solar easier than previously. So there's a lot of research and development that I think it's analogous to what's going on in the technology itself to make the renewable energy technologies even more efficient. Even thin film photovoltaics are being worked on, which could be a radical revolution in photovoltaic technology that would make this transition much easier. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I may have seen the article you're going to send me if it was about New York, because
Um,
it would basically remove the need for some of these transmission lines because
yeah.
they can handle more efficiently the electricity they've got and new electricity they would add from renewables. And they modeled it in New York, but they've actually implemented it someplace like Denmark. I can't remember. So it was a European firm that did that. So you're right. The technology. Uh, I'm an optimist like you are. The technology is moving our direction, and we just got to make sure make the right choices. The problem now is the corporations choose the technologies, and we don't get a say. It's like, how did we get to nuclear? Truman was worried that we are going to run out of oil, so he formed the Paley Commission, and it reported back during the Eisenhower administration and said we should go solar. But Eisenhower said we're going nuclear because we need a peaceful atom to legitimize our nuclear weapons. And, the consumers didn't decide that in the market. The public didn't decide that through their representatives in government. It was a top-down decision by people in the military-industrial complex. So that's why we need eco-socialism. George Rings. As we look back on the prominent IPCC reports, if they were wrong, is it in underestimating climate change effects? Do you think that is still a problem with current models and forecasts?
Look, there may be some. Yeah, it's a good question. There's certainly been a pattern of that. However, a lot of people in the climate science field and activists, become more on top of what's going on there in the modeling. And so they're looking at it more critically. And I think and for instance, in the paper we just produced, we used a very recent assessment of, what the carbon budget is remaining, and there's uncertainty there. So the way to address this is the precautionary principle. Okay, so we need to terminate fossil fuels faster and build renewable faster at the same time, and have the energy capacity to deal with the challenge of the high level of CO2 in the atmosphere and pull it out if necessary, which will probably be necessary. So we need to apply the precautionary principle there. It's a very good question.
Yeah, and one thing people should realize is those reports have to be approved by the governments of the world, including the petrostates, which would be the United States, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and so forth. And so they have a conservative bias built in. And I think the most recent reports, the modeling's got clearer despite the uncertainties like the one you mentioned.
Yeah.
And it becomes harder to, basically say what the science can't let you say. I think one thing people need to look at, the part 3 of the 6th assessment report, the latest IPCC report, has a line in there that a lot of scientists think this is basically rooted in the capitalist system, which is, erratic and, grows without any sense of limits. And whether that line survives when the report is finalized will give you some indication as to how much the governments messed with what the scientists wrote. So we got the report leaked. I think some French people got it leaked, in the late fall, and the report is due, I believe, in February. So we'll see what the final report says, and if that line is still in there.
That's interesting. I think I've seen that. I think it was some Spanish writers that put out degrowth is, and I critique that actually, their take on it. But however, we should not go to the other extreme to say, oh, well, catastrophic climate change is inevitable. All we should do is be prepared for it, and basically degrow. And there was a recent review of a book from some people from Extinction Rebellion on Climate and Capitalism website on this. A very recent review, which was very critical of that view, and I share that critique. That to say, it's inevitable, we can't do anything. Let's just prepare for the catastrophe. That I think is a massive, cowardly position that doesn't confront the remaining possibility that we do have to keep the warming at least to 1.5 degrees. And, I invite people to look at it critically and look at what the real science is telling us on that. I believe that there is still an opportunity, and we should seize it. We owe it to our children and grandchildren of the world to seize this opportunity and not accept defeat.
Yeah, that's a huge debate now in Extinction Rebellion.
Yes.
The old guard calls it climate adaptation, and the younger, more radical people are saying, no, we want climate justice.
That's right, exactly.
It's probably a good thought to begin to end here because we're over the hour.
Oh, and my wife wants us to go out for a walk before the sun sets.
Yeah, well, we try to keep these to about an hour, so
I appreciate this. It was really a chance to, examine some really important issues, and I love the 5 crises that you started with. I think you did a really good job on that.
Is there any last points you want to make before we end?
I would just say that I taught at Howard University for 39 years, and I told my students, don't believe anything I say. Do the research yourself and challenge. And that's what I say to the audience. Do the research, but beware of social media that gives you fake news. Let's put it that way, because there's a lot of that stuff out, particularly around COVID pandemic. So that's my closing thoughts. And does everyone have my email on the chat? dschwartzman@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to correspond with anyone that wants to continue this discussion.
Okay, that's great. My last thought, kind of follows up on what you were saying about, I sort of escaped my mind, but I lost the point. What was your point?
I made more than one.
Yeah.
Climate justice, not just climate adaptation. Well, that's what you were closing.
Oh, I know what it was. Yeah. It was about the fake news. And I was going to remind people, if they haven't read the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists explanations as to why they've got the doomsday clock 100 seconds to midnight.
Yes.
You're looking at 3 things. Of course, nuclear weapons. We're in a new nuclear arms race. The climate crisis. And what's interesting is they talk about disinformation, misinformation on social media that has got people so confused, they don't know what to believe. So they can't, it's harder to, build consensus around demands on our governments. So that's a huge issue. So I would just underscore to people, don't just rely on the sources that you trust for whatever reason, maybe good reasons, but get a little bit into the weeds so you can explain it to your, your grandmother, or, a 12-year-old child. And I think when it's at that level, you
Right.
really understand it. I think that's kind of a measure. So I like what David said about, don't just believe what we say. Check it out for yourself. So
Right.
with that, I'll just say, protect yourselves. We got a new COVID variant now, 1.3 to 1.5 times more transmissible than Omicron. So we're not out of the woods. So please take care of yourself. And we'll see you next week.
Okay. Thank you, Howie. And thank
All
you.
right.